Yeah, here, why don't you try it? Yes, it's about to happen. Well, but it's 10 of 8.
Hello?
You have to click it. You have to.
Hello? Okay, welcome to the California Institute of Integral Studies. And for those of you who have never heard Terence McKenna, you're in for a special treat. And just to take care of a couple of details before we start, this is the public lecture that's going with a Saturday and Sunday workshop. So if anybody's interested in the workshop, that'll be, I think, 10 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday. And there's still room if you're interested, and you can sign up with a gentleman sitting in a chair in the back there at the break and at the end. And I guess we're ready to begin. For those who have never heard Terence, he draws from all disciplines, from anthropology, psychology, philosophy, history, and he's a wealth of information, but beyond that, he's also incredibly entertaining, and you're in for a treat. Take it away.
So can the people in the very back hear? Can you hear back there? Okay. Before I get into the bulk of the lecture, I'll just explain how it will be this evening. I'll talk for about an hour, and then we'll have a brief intermission for coffee and stretching, and then come back and I'll take questions. How many of you have heard me lecture at some time in the past? How many of you heard me lecture at the ITA in Santa Rosa a couple of weeks ago? Oh, good. So we can work those themes all over again. The title of the weekend that I'll be giving here at CIIS is Ethnobotany and Shamanism, Psychedelics Before and After History. This is the third year that I've lectured at CIIS, a course which the core content is a survey of the psychedelic plants of planet Earth and the cultures that have used them, and then discussion of their chemistry, geographical distribution, history of usage, impact on the growth of ideas and historical institutions, and so forth. It's basically an effort to pack a psychobotany course into a weekend. And it is always preceded by this Friday night lecture in which I attempt to give an overview and a sort of state-of-the-art report on psychobotany and why anyone should place any importance upon it. So I sort of think of this lecture as the philosophical implications of psychobotany, past, present, and future. So that is the theme that will guide the lecture this evening. I've been talking about these kinds of things publicly now, well, since 1975, really, with the publication of The Invisible Landscape. And for me personally, it has been an experience of never being able to really anticipate the direction in which this line of thought would develop. It seems to have a life of its own, a richness of its own that is not predictable by the conscious mind. About 3 years ago, I began trying to think about feminism and what role it had, if any, to psychedelics and the role they had played in shaping culture. And it seemed at the time to my critics and to some degree to me that it was almost a kind of opportunism. It's such a safe issue to clothe yourself in that no matter what you're doing, if you can make it part of the feminist agenda, you somehow have become inviolate. But it now seems to me that this thread in thinking about the impact of shamanic and specifically visionary shamanism's impact on culture, it has grown in my own mind more and more important. The rise of the consciousness of Gaia, which is the notion of the planet as, at the very least, a self-regulating system, and possibly at the other end of the scale as actually a kind of conscious intellecty, a kind of super being or oversoul that by the control of planktonic populations on the surface of the sea can regulate rainfall and thus control the density of vegetation on the continents and thereby regulate the composition of the atmosphere, and by a series of interlocking, interwoven feedback loops actually create a kind of biological or organic homeostasis, which is the precondition for the evolution of advanced organisms. And this idea of Gaia, or of perceiving the earth as a living organism, has been, I think, the intellectual or philosophical centerpiece of what feminism has done with its agenda in the last 15 years or so. But this enthusiasm for the goddess, this enthusiasm for the seamless web of life, has not yet clarified itself as a philosophical intention sufficiently to draw certain obvious conclusions about the relationship that it should have to shamanism, number one, and most specifically to psychedelic shamanism. Now, why? What is the connection there? Well, what I would like to suggest is that the condition of cultural neurosis in which we as moderns reside might operationally be described as ego inflation. And that specifically it is the masculine ego that is inflated. Now, the cause for this has been sought by various different commentators on culture, but none of them have suggested that the tumorous growth of the masculine ego as a cultural and individual institution is specifically due to the absence of the dissolving agency of psychoactive ecstasy induced by plants. Do you see where I'm going with this? So that, in fact, the modern enthusiasm for shamanism, and secondarily or in a connected mode with psychedelics, is actually an intuitive feeling back toward this state of non-neurotic empathy that characterized archaic time. And that is what has specifically been lost by the descent into the historical process. And this notion that that something was lost which is tangible then allows us to set a radical reconstructive agenda for society. Because if what was lost was tangible, rather than, say, the goodwill of God Almighty, which is not something tangible. And that's the culture myth, that we lost the goodwill of God Almighty, so we had to leave Eden and descend into toil. But notice that if we take the story of Eden more seriously, more literally, what we're dealing with is a struggle over use and abuse of available psychoactive compounds in the Edenic environment. And that, in fact, the challenge to Yahweh was the challenge of the woman who sought to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, to have the knowledge of good or evil, which would place the man and the woman on an equal footing with God. And this aspiration to gnosis, this desire to transcend the ordinary and penetrate into the realm of existential truth, was enough to get them canned out of Eden. Now I want to cast further back into time and sort of lay the groundwork for this case about the male ego. But before I do that, I want to ask you to review in your own mind for a moment certain curious facts about the religions of Western culture, the tradition of monotheism as it's practiced in the West. First of all, this is the only, and any student of myth who wishes to correct me is welcome to do so, this is the only theogony, the only God system that I know of in which the head honcho has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with women, does not have a mother, does not have a consort, does not have a daughter. It's a locker room religion from the get-go. Now, it was the insight of Carl Jung and his school to understand that myths are narcissistic reflections of our own aspirations as individuals and societies. And when you look at the monotheistic hypostatization of God with omnipotence, omniscience, all power, all moral suasion, everything is held in the hands of the Father God, who is characterized by wrath and an obsession with punishment and with the carrying out of what are essentially punishments related to taboos. In other words, sins which are not clearly sins for any reason other than that they are forbidden. And this model of God became the model for the personalities, the atomic personalities that were creating the civilizations that worshipped in this fashion. In other words, that became a way to be omniscient, omnipresent, brooking no opposition, swift to punish, stern in all demands, so forth and so on. And this shift, and it was a shift because the pre-pottery Neolithic level in the Middle East seems very clearly and generally to be a goddess culture, a religion based on pastoralism and a large amount of gathering integrated into hunting. That goddess-oriented wandering pastoral religion gave way to the fixed settlement, Neolithic, male-dominated model that in its many adumbrations has persisted into the present moment. Well, as I said, I believe the reasons for this lie further in the past, in the moments of human emergence that occurred 15, 20,000 years before the appearance of the goddess cultures in the ancient Near East. The critical moment, I believe, occurred in Africa during the process of the desertification of the African continent. The previously arboreal pack hunting or arboreal primates descended onto the grasslands, which was an environment of increased nutritional pressure. And there, bipedalism, binocular vision, the opposable thumb, which had probably existed earlier, all these things were channeled into creating a highly efficient, omnivorous, pack-hunting creature. And the key word here is omnivorous. One of the great and unexplained lacunas in modern evolutionary theory is that evolutionary primatologists have not made any attempt to discuss the impact on human evolution of changes in diet, which were swift and unusual in this evolving grassland situation. Let me explain what I mean. Most animals have a very selective and restricted diet. So consequently, whatever the chemical composition of that diet, over millions of years of exposure, the animal forms a relationship of adaptability to whatever its food source is. When an animal population becomes omnivorous under pressure on the availability of nutrition, suddenly the animal begins to test for possible food sources in the environment. Well, this testing for food sources in the environment introduces a vast number of mutagenic compounds into the bodies of these animals. Not only psychoactive compounds, but depressants, stimulants, things which interfere with RNA transcription, things which enhance or suppress the immune system, things which retard or clarify vision, things which suppress appetite, things which interfere with the estrus cycle. Remind yourself for a moment that orthonovum and the birth control pills are all derived, the compounds in those pills are derived from Dioscorea plants grown in huge plantations in Mexico, a kind of tropical yam. Well, yams in the tropics are now and always have been a major food source for foraging primates. And yet some varieties of yams contain so much of these hormone-like substances that they send the reproductive cycle and ovulation and all these things just into a tizzy. Well, you can imagine the impact, the evolutionary speed-up that this decision to go omnivorous would have on these evolving primates. And I maintain that the prolongation of infantile traits in human beings, some of which persist throughout our entire lives, such as our that too. I was thinking of our relative hairlessness and stuff like that. But you're right, it's a puzzle. Every generation thinks that the generation which it spawns is more infantile yet than it was. And somebody wrote me a letter recently suggesting that this was a good thing and it would end with us simply skipping the life in 3D phase, and you would just go from fetus to chip and skip over this whole messy three-dimensional cultural phase. But I digress. In this welter of chemical compounds impacting on the evolution of these primates were, among other things, psychoactive compounds. The most important of which, I believe, was probably psilocybin, which occurs in fungi which grow in the manure of these pre-domesticated herds of wild cattle and bison that characterized the African environment. And I myself in Kenya observed baboon behavior, and the standard baboon behavior is to run around sniffing the ground and basically looking for bugs and turning over cow pies, because underneath cow pies there are likely to be bugs, and testing everything as a food, sniffing things. Well, the mushroom is an extremely noticeable part of this grassland environment. When present, I mean, it's almost like an artifact of some sort. Everything else is pretty humdrum, but then you get these perfectly symmetrical, silvery, proto-technological shapes scattered through something certain to be noticed by a foraging primate. Well, once ingested, even in low amounts, visual acuity increases. Roland Fisher, who gave psilocybin to over 25,000 people in the early 60s before it was made illegal, invented a device where by turning a crank they could deform two metal bars, deform their parallel state so that they were no longer parallel. And then they would sit graduate students in front of this thing and ask them to push a button when the lines were no longer parallel. And they discovered that people who had been given small amounts of psilocybin could detect this falling out of parallel much more readily than people who had not been given psilocybin. And Fisher, in his wonderful, ponderous Viennese style, said to me, and so you see, here's empirical proof that drugs give you a better picture of reality than their absence. In this single case, empirical proof. But you don't have to know a lot about primate evolution to know the kind of impact that an increase in visual acuity would have on a population of pack-hunting animals, where coordination of the hunt means the difference between life and death. Of course, it means that those animals which are accepting the mushroom into their food chain are going to be more successful hunters, hence have more food for their offspring, hence a more successful reproductive strategy, hence selection in favor of those animals tolerant enough to accept the psilocybin. That's at the low dose level. But of course, the mushroom was being experimented at many dose levels, low, intermediate, and high. At intermediate dose levels, all CNS stimulants cause what is called arousal, an interesting side effect of which is erection. So at intermediate doses, suddenly there is an activation of an interest in sexual activity. Well, again, this too contributes to a more successful reproductive strategy, because those who copulate most tend to reproduce most in a natural population. So the first two factors, increased visual acuity and increased sexual appetite, both push the creode towards selection for those animals willing to admit these compounds into their food chain. But what is much more interesting then is the effect at higher doses, where something happens that we, for all our Cray 4s, space shuttles, DNA decoders, and so forth, are as in awe of and as bewildered by as those pack-hunting primates on the plains of Africa 50,000 years ago. In other words, the psychedelic tremendum. And in a way, the evolutionary impact of this third level of admission of psilocybin into the diet is what we are grappling with to this day, because people like Henry Munn and others have shown, and I think anyone can gather this experience for themselves if they will but give it a whirl, that psilocybin in fact stimulates the language-forming capacity of the brain, whatever that is. I mean, we don't know. There seems to be a silent area of the brain symmetrical with Broca's area. And this silent area is heavily impacted by these psychedelic compounds, as is Broca's area. This is why glossolalia, spontaneous chanting, all kinds of cognitive activities related to language seem to be stimulated by these things. And one of the ideas that I would like to leave you with this evening is that these psychedelic compounds in the environment act as though they were enzymes. And an enzyme, to give you the definition, is an organic catalyst. A catalyst is something which speeds up a chemical reaction, but is itself not consumed in the reaction. And these psychedelic compounds catalyze that function, which we can most broadly label the imagination. In other words, the entire theater of cognitive activity, song, dance, language, meme, symbolic expression, all are stimulated by this indole pseudo-neurotransmitter present in the environment and potentially present in the human food chain. Now, there are two ways I think that you can go on this. One, and I'll follow both to their conclusions, I hope. Guide me back if I get lost. One way to react to this peculiar confluence of facts is to just breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, how fortunate. Because otherwise, apparently what you're saying is we wouldn't be here. And that's right. That's what I am saying, that there was this coincidental or apparently coincidental juxtaposition of synergistic forces which called forth then a tool-using, symbol-using, mnemonically oriented, self-reflecting kind of animal, an entirely different kind of creature than had ever been seen before. And the relationship which this creature had to this mystery was one of exploration and seamless immersion. And we do not stand outside of this mystery. In other words, it is trivial and insulting to talk about this stuff from the point of view of anthropology, because anthropology somehow assumes that it possesses the epistemic bottom line, when it is in fact some kind of hideously disgraced Cartesian social science that is just whistling past the graveyard. And that, in fact, we ourselves do not know what the psychedelic dimension is. Is it synesthesia? Is it somehow a piling up of sensory input unfiltered by cultural mechanisms? These are all reductionist models that have been tried by one school or another. Psychotomimetic means it's madness. That's what it is. It's just madness. It's immersion in the unconscious. It's dissolution of the syntactical machinery so that things don't make any sense anymore because the syntactical structures by which we mediate and recognize meaning have somehow been swept away. But the problem with all of these models is that it isn't that meaning has been swept away. It's that meaning is emergent, but the meaning runs completely antithetical to everything we've ever been taught or believe. In other words, it isn't an experience entirely of the dissolution of boundaries and the replication of some kind of chaos. It is rather the revelation of a hidden order, an order which cultural institutions seem to deny. Well, now, what is this hidden order which it reveals? It seems to me, and at this stage, basically what we have are the accounts of explorers. There is no academy of psychedelics. There is nobody who can slap you down and count you wrong. But it seems to me that what it argues is at least that nature is animate. At least that somehow spirit is not merely a metaphor. Spirit is a fact that we have somehow been culturally deconditioned to perceive. And so the model of the world that we inherit from our immediate ancestors, which is the Cartesian, mechanistic, materialistic world of matter, energy, angular momentum, and charge, the world of science, is actually shown to be simply a cultural fiction, simply some kind of convenient illusion that allows money-making processes to go on. I mean, it's basically an attitude of, we know enough about reality to make money. What else do you need to know? To ask deeper questions is just going to spoil the party. Now, the other tack to take on this is to not see the presence of these psychoactive alkaloids in nature as simply fortuitous, but to instead see some order, some plan in all of this. Shamanism is consistently the intuition not only of the animate possibility of nature, but of the inhabited and intelligent possibility of nature. That shamans, visionary shamans, actually come and go from a world of embodied intelligence, embodied in a dimension that we can ordinarily not perceive. And this is strange news and hard to get the word out because the cultural expectation mitigates against it so entirely. We are willing to grant the possibility that certain very exalted people, having placed themselves under the tutelage of a few very select lineages, may, after years of ass-busting work and dedication, be led into at least the antechamber of the possibility, of the shadow, of the mystery. But we are not prepared to deal with the possibility that 40 seconds away from any given point in time, you can dissolve yourself into an inhabited nearby dimension filled with animate intelligence and raging alien orgasmic beauty. And yet this is so. This is so. And it does not require what is ordinarily thought of as spiritual discipline. What it requires is courage, which is rarely ever called into practice around the ashram and the zendo. I mean, courage is not something that when you go on a 30-day retreat, there probably isn't a single moment in which you're really slammed to the wall in the dimension of courage. Well, so my entree into all of this, besides being part of Berkeley culture in the 60s, was going to the Amazon and seeing that, what was promised in the higher religions, what was promised in alchemy, Kabbalah, yoga, all these things, was actually just a fact of ordinary experience to the rainforest-dwelling populations that had kept very, very close to the archaic, had never left the hunting-gathering mode, had never burned, had never created pastoralism, had never created phonetic languages, and, the most primitive of the primitive. And those people had held on to this vision and the technology that makes it possible. And it was for them entirely a technology of the manipulation of exterior elements in the environment. They didn't have this purity of the body, nature as vile, penetrating, polluting force, which is what informs all of these more vertically organized religions. They have an absolute horror of the world as given. They want to get you out of it. They want you to have as little to do with it as possible. Sexuality is highly suspect, so forth and so on. Well, until the puzzle in all this for me is how this fact, and by this fact I mean the penetration of this alien dimension by these shamanic cultures, how this fact can continue to be hushed up and fail to penetrate into the ongoing cultural dialogue about our own planetary future. And it really is not penetrating. This may appear to be a crowd, but there are billions who know nothing of what we speak. And, to my mind, this psychedelic dimension is part of the human birthright, as much as the sexual dimension is part of the human birthright. Now, there have been cultures in the past, the Calvinism of Geneva, Victorian England, where repression of sexuality was so total that you could almost get through life without hearing about it. And our level of repression of this optional mental life is approaching the same level of hysterical repression. And yet, my take on solutions, if there are any solutions in the predicament in which we find ourselves globally, is they are going to come from a kind of archaic revival, a kind of attempt to step out of the historical vehicle and let it just sail over the cliff without us. Because if we don't step out, leap at the last moment from the historical vehicle, we will be carried with it into some kind of fiery conflagration. That's the momentum of these egocentric, materialistic, positivist philosophies that have gotten loose over the past 1,000 years and are just running amok across the surface of the planet. The escape is forward into the past. In other words, a revivifying of the archaic. And this has been sensed for over 100 years. I mean, people like L'Entremont and Alfred Jarry in the arts, and Lobachevsky and Riemann in mathematics, and of course Einstein in the early years of this century. All of these people were anticipating aspects of this archaism. And so was Freud, and so was Jung, and in their own bizarre way, so were the Nazis, and so was the psychedelic revival of the 60s. These are all various pieces, various facets of the archaic possibility. Not all of them, obviously, attractive. But in the same way that the breakup of the medieval world caused a revisioning of classicism, and that's in fact what happened as the medieval world fell to pieces. People who called themselves humanists said, there has to be another way to do it. How can we do it? And they looked back and they discovered Plato and Aristotle and the Hermetic corpus and all of that, and revivified that, and Roman law and Roman architecture and Roman technology, and all of this they revivified. We face a much deeper, more global crisis, and the only common past as a global culture we have is 15, 18,000 years old. The flowering of the Magdalenian era, before the loss of the partnership society, before the coming of the Tanged Point techno-complex, before the fall of Mycenae, before, in what mythologically we call Eden. But the centerpiece, the watch spring that drove the machinery of that ancient culture was the psychedelic experience as mediated by plants. That's what kept the feminine in place, was that the culture and every member of it was frequently experiencing complete boundary dissolution and complete release into an oceanic dimension that gave correct perspective on the microsecond life of the individual. And this is the same experience that people have to some degree with psychedelics today. It's perspective is what it is. And perspective, when practiced on that level of intensity, becomes dissolving of pre-programmed patterns. Because all the near-term models, who am I, who are you, what is this country, what is Western civilization, what is the modern world, these near-term models are simply cultural fictions of some sort. I mean, the fact is that we don't know what is going on. And we have value-charged languages which we lay over the chaos like grids, and we rally others around our language grids to create what we call consensus, understanding, and then we kill everybody who disagrees with that, and that further cements reality. And by this means, we completely opt into some cultural model. And it doesn't matter what the cultural model is. And this is something that I think other commentators on shamanism may have missed, that it is as hard for an Amazonian Indian to take ayahuasca as it is for a resident of Telegraph Hill. There is no culture that prepares you for that. There is no set of socially sanctioned values that will allow you to make sense of the psychedelic experience unless you have within yourself a certain reservoir of native understanding that will pull you through.
If you find you're too tired, I I won't be the one to tell you not to go where your heart commands. Life demands we wait to find out where we'll be when we climb from the folds in our bed.